let me start right into some of the questions you asked, because you got me thinking. And I hope that you will, if I actually get to the material I wanted to talk about today, that you will tell me whether or not it makes sense, because I'm just, I always say I'm starting a book until I'm finishing a book. I am I won't say the last polishing stages, those go on forever, but I'm rethinking some of the ways I've organized some stuff, and I want to talk to about some of that today. And you can tell me if it makes any sense. But let me start today with Montana's a nice place. Don't say that's a surprise. With some of the things that are fairly easy to knock off the list of questions you asked. So first of all, people are asking what it means that Trump is demanding the unredacted affidavit that led to the search warrant for the FBI to go to Mar-a-Lago and recover really quite top secret documents that he had stashed there. And I want to start by emphasizing that that material belongs to us, belongs to you and me. By the Presidential Records Act, it all has to be it has to go to the National Archives and Records Administration, also known as NARA, N-A-R-A, which may not come across your horizon all that often, but there are offices of the National Records and National Archives and Records Administration around the country, and they are where our memory is stored, essentially. So the reason that we want to make sure we have all the records of a presidential administration is because we want not necessarily immediately to know what that administration did, but we need to know what we need to actually understand what it did over time, so that we know, for example, about our history in Chile, or about what the Congress has done, or any number of things. And I could tell you more about the history of how we got to that point, but the point here is that all of those documents belong to us. They belong to you and me. And a president cannot just say, oh, I'm taking these. That's not an option any longer. And the idea that you can just sort of declassify things by saying so is also wrong. There's a series of hoops that a president has to go through in order to declassify things. And there are some things that have parallel declassification structures. And some of these documents may have fallen into that, which says the president alone can't do it. There has to be a series of decisions made to declassify something. So that is what is at stake with those documents. And when you hear people say, oh, he just declassified them, it makes people like me, our heads explode, because of our understanding of just how important records are, and that those records are not just about what an individual president wants to do. They're about our country and the way our country remembers its history. And I'm going to wax a little bit off the train here and point out that one of the things that I believe is that the way we remember things is one of the key ways in which the human species differentiates itself from many other species, because we not only remember the passage of time, we make stories about the passage of time. And if you rip pieces of people's history out, they can't fully understand who they are. So I'm kind of rabid on the subject of a president can't just say, oh, no, you're not allowed to have that, because that's ours. That's who we are. And it is vitally important to who we are. So that's what those documents are. But the reason that there's an argument about, or a move to get the unredacted, and redacting is black lines, so you can't read things. So, for example, if you're interested, you can look at the Mueller report online, or the Senate Intelligence Report, a number of Senate Intelligence reports, but the one that I'm thinking of right now is the one on Russia's interference in the 2016 election. And if you look at that, they'll be like typing, 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 and then there'll be a heavy black line. And you can't see shapes or anything through it, so that you can't read names, for example, or telephone numbers, or sometimes you can't read information. So a redacted document is one that there have been the sensitive parts of it cut out, so that, you know, some Yahoo like me can't grab somebody's phone number and just start calling it. All right. So once we had seen the search warrant for Mar-a-Lago, for the recovery of documents, there's a real question at stake, because the search warrant, according to lawyers, says that, I'm sorry, to get a search warrant, you have to have new information. You can't just sort of say, oh, I think this is out there. You need new information. So there is an implication with that search warrant that there has been new information that suggests that the former president had in his possession secret documents, which he was not supposed to have. Now, as you know, there was a subpoena for him to return materials that he had taken, and the NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration, recovered about 15 boxes of documentation, and boxes are generally sort of bankers' boxes, and that doesn't mean they're stuffed full, but normally archivists measure things in feet and boxes. So when they say boxes, they literally mean a banker's box. Again, it doesn't mean it's full, but that's how they categorize things, and boxes are kind of like a filing system. Anyway, it became clear to the Department of Justice that Trump did have more documents, and how they knew that we're not sure. There is the suggestion that there was somebody within Mar-a-Lago or close to Trump who tipped off the Department of Justice, but it's not the only possible place that information could have come from. So, for example, Tom Barrack, who was a key fundraiser for Donald Trump and an advisor to him in 2016, and was deeply involved not only in lobbying for the United Arab Emirates, but also in the IP3 company that was initially designed to, in June of 2016, to sell nuclear technology to the Saudis. He's coming up for trial in September. So maybe his lawyers asked for documents, and then when they went to look for them, they weren't there. I mean, there's any number of ways that things could have come up. Anyway, so in order to get a search warrant, the Department of Justice had to take to a judge information that said, this is why we think that that these documents are in a certain place, what they are, where they are, and that a crime has been committed. And so that the search warrant itself was interesting, but now the affidavit that led them to get the search warrant for a judge to say, yeah, I think you're right, is of great interest to a number of news organizations, because that's their job and it's a hot story, but also to Trump. And why? Because if that affidavit has information like, you know, I'm going to pick on John Smith here again, told us this is what he saw, Trump knows where that information came from. Now, why does the Department of Justice not want that information to come out? They've asked a judge not to release that document because they're worried about the safety of that person. And that seems only to make sense, considering the Trump allies have threatened the lives not only of FBI directors, but also of election workers and governors and anybody who opposes Trump, but also because that source of information might cease to give more information if in fact that person was revealed or the place was revealed. So that's where that the desire for the unredacted, why Trump desperately wants the unredacted affidavit, and why news people want it, and why the Department of Justice really doesn't want it to come out. But what's interesting about their filing on what shouldn't come out is they said giving up that name would hurt an ongoing criminal investigation. And those were words that really jumped off the page to people who are curious about what the Department of Justice is doing with regard to Donald Trump. So that was an easy one to get rid of there. Somebody asked about somebody asked here too about third-party candidates, because of course we have Andrew Yang and his people coming up with this forward party, which is one of the most incoherent things I've ever seen. And this is my field, third parties and all that sort of thing. The issue here is that and somebody also asked, how often do parties morph from their old values? So those are two different questions, but they are not unrelated in that right now, theoretically, we have two major parties, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And as I keep saying, they have risen at extremely different times, and they had very different ideologies. They are not one side and the other side of a coin. They're very different. So when the Democratic Party rose in the late 1820s, early 1830s, centering around Andrew Jackson. I'm going to tell you the ideology. I'm probably not going to have the time to tell you all the permutations of it and all of the ways in which it was incredibly hypocritical, although they're very interesting. But what they began to articulate in the 1820s and the 1830s was the idea that it was the role of government to level the playing field between the haves and the have-nots. Now, the reality was that's not the way they were behaving in the 1830s and the 1840s, but that's their argument, that they're sort of, I always think of them as a line. They're kind of like a teeter-totter or a seesaw. When people get too rich, the Democrats come in and say, no, you're getting too much. So their primary ideology was to defend the have-nots, or the working man, if you will, against the elite people who they believed were running society. Like I say, please recognize that there's many ways in which that was incredibly hypocritical. But for my purposes today, their ideology is the government's role is to level the playing field. That's what they're supposed to do. Now, the Republicans rise in a very different time. They rise in the 1850s. And in the 1850s, the Democrats have, in fact, used that ideology of the haves versus the have-nots to essentially create an oligarchy. The Southern slaveholders, the elite slave enslavers have taken over the government, and they're using the government to enrich themselves, essentially. I can't tell you how watered down this version is. But so the Republican Party rises with the idea that they're going to stop the concentration of power among a small group of elite enslavers, but they do so with a very different ideology. So when they form in about 1855, 1856, they articulate that they're to stand against those elite democratic Southern enslavers, the people they call the slave power. But it's really Abraham Lincoln who articulates a new vision for the Republicans. And what he argues is not that it's the government's role to broker between the haves and the have-nots. He argues that it's the government's role to support people at the bottom of the economy, the men who are on the make, because they will produce more than they can consume, and what they overproduce, he literally calls pre-exerted labor, is capital. And that capital that they accumulate will also support shopkeepers and shoemakers and the next level of industry. They too will produce more than they can consume. And they, in turn, will keep in business a few industrialists and financiers who will hire people at the bottom, and the whole cycle will start again. So I always think of the Republican vision as being sort of a circle. The idea that, you help people at the bottom, they help the middle, they help the top, they help the people at the top, help the bottom, and you have this, what one of my students called a never-ending pyramid scheme, although they didn't call it that at the time. At one point, the Chicago Tribune says, until every beggar has a coach in four, we shall never get out of business in this world. In both cases, it was not impossible, and you could even say easy, for powerful men to monopolize those parties and their ideology and use the government to concentrate power in their own hands. And that's happened with the Democratic Party, primarily in the 1850s, and then the Democrats take a very different track. But with the Republican Party, that idea of everybody being in this circle, it became very easy a number of times for Republican leaders to say, in order to make this circle work, I got to help the people at the top. So in the 1890s and the 1920s, and again in the present, you've had the Republican Party really kind of abandoning the reality of its old ideology and starting simply to focus on the very rich. All right, so what happens when the parties go off track and lose their ideology is they open up frustration among their adherents and their opponents, and that creates room for there to be either a third party or people to jump ship and go to the other party. Now, the thing about third parties in America is manyfold, and one of them is that because these two parties have been dominant now for however many years that is, a couple hundred years, that means that people have very strong personal loyalties to them. My dad was a Democrat, I'm a Democrat, or my mom was a Republican, I'm a Republican, I live in a Republican town. They have very strong personal loyalties, and also those parties have very strong infrastructures. So, and that's no small thing, especially nowadays, to have email lists, for example, and voter lists, and, to sort of know where the the important people are in the town, and all that sort of institutional knowledge. So it's very difficult for a third party to challenge these existing parties. So when does a third party start to challenge existing parties successfully? And the thing to which we always point is the Populist Party and the alliance and the Populist Party in the 1880s and the 1890s. And what happens with them is that they recognize that there is real chaos, that the parties are not answering the needs of workers and of farmers. And they organize their own party. But what's interesting about the Populists is that they essentially adopt the language of the Civil War Republicans. So they don't come in and say, we're going to completely change the structure of everything. Mind you, they do. They're incredibly anti-Semitic. But they start to articulate the old-fashioned language of the fact that the government should really help people at the bottom and not people at the top. So they begin to get, they offer a bunch of proposals based in that idea. And at the time, the Republicans go, oh my God, they're all radicals. And the Democrats are like, we don't quite know what to make of this. And they get enough of their people elected that they're able to really be swing votes in a lot of crucial ways, especially in the Western states. What that does is it makes the major parties recognize that they need to adopt their platforms, their policies in order to attract their voters. And so they do. By the 20th century, most of what the populists wanted is in place in one of the major parties. So what they've done is they have put enough pressure on the major parties to adopt their measures. And the same could be said of a group that we know less about, but it's still very much there, which are the mugwumps in 1884, when especially Republicans recognized that the modern-day Republican Party, modern day meaning the 1880s, I'm sorry, that's kind of my world, has gone off the rails. So they say we can't be party to this anymore. We're still Republicans, but we're voting Democratic in 1884, which is how we get Grover Cleveland. And we embrace that idea of reform. And the Republicans are like, crap, we better do something, or we're never gonna win again. So they actually start to adopt a lot of the policies that the mugwumps insist on. And of course, one of the key figures that grows out of that movement, he's not a mugwump himself, is Teddy Roosevelt. So the answer to third parties is that I've told you about the successful third parties. They tend to be ones who reiterate the principles of the American government and recognize that what they're really trying to do is to reassert the values of either the Democratic or the Republican parties in their different ways. Third parties that are offering essentially vanity campaigns like the liberal Republicans in 1872 don't tend to do very well because they're very easily poked fun at. And third parties that don't offer a whole view of government, if you will, and I'll explain that in a minute, don't do well either. And what I mean by that is that third parties, one of the things about a democratic system that, like ours, is in order to be a viable party, you need to be able to convince voters that you can handle everything from, foreign affairs through, fisheries, through taxes. You have to sort of be all of government. And that's very, very hard to do out of the box. So it's hard to get a third party that jumps out and says, yeah, I'm going to be able to handle everything from China through, the making of, sewing needles. And that's too much for most third parties to take on. That being said, in this particular moment, one of the things that I have looked for years is for the kind of movement that we saw in the 1890s and in the 1950s in the Republican Party. And that was a move to reclaim traditional Republican ideology. Because today's Republicans, while they still command the apparatus of the party, and very deliberately, Donald Trump stacked the state apparatus with his own loyalists, as you can tell now. While they still command that apparatus of the party, they no longer articulate something that most Americans believe in. So if a Republican stepped up and started to articulate those values again, they would, I think, have a very good shot at not a third party necessarily, but at reclaiming the Republican Party. And one of the people I'm watching very closely on this is Beto O'Rourke in Texas, who, of course, he's a Democrat, not a Republican, but he is articulating many of the values that were traditional Republican values, even though, I mean, the overlap between Democrats and Republicans is a lot in a moment like this. So he's a Democrat, but he's using language that is seemingly prompting crossover voting. So as long as we have the voting system that we have, I think the chances of getting viable third parties is difficult. Now, if you changed to ranked choice voting, that changes everything up. And I, as I think I've told you before, I was a skeptic of ranked choice voting, but I'm thrilled with the way it plays in Maine. So it essentially opens up the way for more voices to be heard and to be able to affect the way that that eventual leaders will act. All right, so people asked more specific questions here about Trump's passports. That was really interesting because he completely misrepresented what happened there. What happened was that in their search of Mar-a-Lago, the agents took a file that apparently had passports, including, I believe it was 2 expired passports, not 1, in it. And they told him they had it and they weren't supposed to have it and they were going to return it. That's when he realized he didn't have it. And that's when he went, online and said, oh, they're stealing all my stuff. But in fact, they have offered to return it. And I suspect at this point already have. So they gave a list to Trump's lawyer of what they had taken from Mar-a-Lago. And in some of those files, there will be material that they do not have that they were not supposed to take, and they will return that. And one of those things was Trump's passports. So a lot of people thought that that was a sign. They thought he was a flight risk. The fact that they are, I wouldn't read anything into that. They just took them and now they have given them back because of where they were stored. All right. So Social Security people asked about. You should be concerned about what's happening with Social Security because the Republican Party as it currently exists, and I want to emphasize this is not my Republican Party, and by mine I mean, I'm a historian of the Republican Party, so I probably know them better than anybody in this country at this point. The current day Republican Party are radical. They are an extraordinarily radical group of Americans. I'm not sure we've ever seen such a radical group, with the possible exception of the former Confederates in 1879 when they went back into Congress, who tried to destroy the government at that point, and they were really quite radicalized. But their whole ideology is based on the idea of destroying the federal government system that we have lived with since 1933. They believe that using the federal government to regulate business, to provide a basic social safety net, to promote infrastructure, and to protect civil rights is illegitimate. They believe that, in fact, it's the states that should do everything except foreign affairs and the military, that the true American democracy belongs in the states. And in order to return everything to the states, they're doing a huge misreading of the Constitution, of course. They've stacked the Supreme Court to be full of so-called originalists who want to take our jurisprudence back to the days before the Supreme Court used the 14th Amendment to protect civil rights, for example, and to defend the government's right to regulate business. And all of that now is on the table. The idea that all of that legislation that regulated since 1933 and FDR's term, that regulated business, that protects civil rights, and that provides a basic social safety net and promotes infrastructure, that all of that is illegitimate. So what is the key element of our basic social safety net? It's the Social Security Act, which passed on this about this date, not on this date, but around this date in 1935, and I think it's 35. The Social Security Act, while many people remember it as being about protecting people in their old age. That's certainly true, but the reason that people emphasize that element of it was because elderly people voted in the 1930s, and the other people who are protected by that act did not. So children, for example, are protected by the Social Security Act, so are widows, and so are the disabled. And so are people, there are also elements of that that went on to protect workers, and it was sort of the gemstone that represented a basic social safety net. Now, it doesn't do everything, and of course we've ramped it up in different ways, and we've added things and all sorts of things since then, but it is the crown jewel of our basic social safety net. And yes, the Republicans have offered a number of arguments for getting rid of it altogether, for cutting it, or for getting rid of it altogether. And the most prominent, of course, is Rick Scott of Florida, who is the head of the Senate fundraising for Republicans. His job is to get Republicans elected to the Senate. And he has proposed a plan for the Republicans going forward. Now, the Mitch McConnell said, I don't want to have a plan for the midterm elections. I want people to elect us, and then we're going to tell them what we're going to do, because he knows that what the Republicans want to do is not popular. Rick Scott has actually put together a plan, and in that plan he has called for the sunsetting of every law every 5 years. So any law can last only 5 years, and his argument is that if they're popular, they'll get passed again. And the problem with that, of course, is that the current day radicals in the Republican Party are refusing to pass anything, and they're using the filibuster to stop very popular measures from passing, at the same time that they're using gerrymandering in the House of Representatives to make sure that the Republicans control many more seats in the House of Representatives than they would if it were not for gerrymandering. So it's completely disingenuous to say, oh, if it's popular, it'll be repassed. And this is one of the reasons people like me are like, you know, this is a big election coming up here. So that's what's going on with Social Security. And one of the pieces I think that's important to remember when we mention things like Social Security is that the program, as I say, of the current day Republican Party, it's been taken over by extremists, and their plan really is to get rid of the government that we've had since 1933. They would like to take us back to 1920, the 1920s, with the argument that the government should never get in between the force or get involved in the forces of the market. You know, they believe that markets will regulate themselves, and that the minute that the government gets involved, they disrupt the markets, and that hurts economic growth. The idea behind that it has been completely disproven. I mean, that's kind of what shocks me, is when you look at the 1920s, you read the ideology from the 1920s. In a way, it's kind of I hate to say charming, but they really believe that this system is going to work, they really believe that it's going to mean that everybody does better, and that everybody does well, and the country is going to boom. And coming out of World War I, with all the technologies that were developed during World War I and the pent-up economic energy of World War I, we get new radios, and we get nylon stockings, and we get refrigerators, and we get new magazines, and we get advertising, and it really and we get radio, and it really seems like, yeah, they have created this incredibly powerful economy. But the reality was that it was only a very few Americans who were benefiting from that economy. The real wages of workers were not going up in the 1920s. The money was all going to people at the top. And of course, when the stock market crashes in October of 1929, there was not enough buying power in the rest of the country to pick up the slack. And we ended up going into this excruciating depression that is what FDR, with the budding understanding of Keynesian economics, which hadn't really been worked out yet, but he moves forward with the idea that, in fact, the government has a job to do to give Americans a new deal than the one they have had, a new deal in which they will regulate business. So the guys playing the stock market can't cheat. And it's not just regular guys on the street who want that to happen. It's actually investors themselves and people trying to start new businesses who are saying, you know, we can't start a business if the whole system's rigged. So he started to regulate the economy, regulate business so that workers couldn't do things like take their workers and put them on a bus and drive them to the middle of a desert and push them into the middle of a desert and drive off and leave them to walk back if they could and didn't die of thirst, which is literally something that happened in the 1920s in Arizona. So they started to put guardrails around the ways that workers would be treated by their employers. And what we discovered from that is from 1933 to 1981, the distance between the wealthiest and the poorest Americans compressed. And economists call it the Great Compression. And in that period, we had good education and we had more equality of opportunity. And as people started to feel more confident that they were going to be able to feed their children, for example, and have a roof over their heads, our tensions, our racial and ethnic tensions improved significantly. So if you think, for example, of the fact that a group of white men passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and that there was a move for increased investment in our underprivileged areas in the country from the 1930s on, all of those things happened during this period of Great Compression. And then when Reagan comes into office and slashes social programs and pours money into the military, which meant it went into the defense industry, and at the same time slashes taxes, immediately on every possible chart you will see wealth and from the top and the bottom splitting very dramatically. So we know that that system that they're trying to return us to doesn't work. But what we're seeing instead now is this argument that even though it might not look great on paper, this is true America. This argument that, in fact, we have to return power to the states. And so when you see things like the attacks on Social Security, that's what they're talking about. And they're talking about getting rid of and Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health. Those were attempts to throw everything back to the states and to gut the ability of the federal government to do the sorts of things that I, anyway, think are a really good idea. And as I say, this is incredibly radical, the idea of taking us backward in time, back to the 1920s. And I've said this before, but I actually think it's an important point and worth repeating, that, you know, I think one of the reasons that we are in such a tense time now is because while other countries since the 1980s have been modernizing, have been keeping up with the changes that were required by a modern economy, we didn't. We've been moving backward because of the modern day Republican Party. So now we're facing the attempt to leap forward, you know, 40 or 50 years. And that's really, really very, very difficult to do. And there are some people who see that as completely overturning their worlds. Whereas if you look, for example, back even at things like the police riot of 1968 in Chicago, in the summer of '68, it looks quaint compared to nowadays. We have militarized, we've done all sorts of things that have put it in a very different place than we were in the 1960s and the 1970s. All right, so that was about Social Security. A couple of questions here about, let me do a little bit more with that. The reason that I wanted to go into that was because one of the things that I think we're really underplaying nowadays is that the whole point and the whole ability of the current day Republican Party to continue to destroy the federal government depends on people believing the federal government doesn't work. Remember, that's how Reagan gets elected. He says, you know, government in the modern crisis, the government not the solution to the problem. The government is the problem. And the Republicans constantly insist that the federal government doesn't work. And they have done things like defunded things. And then they turn around and say, see, it doesn't work because it doesn't have enough people to work any longer. And they've also done things, for example, like defunded the Internal Revenue Service so that it doesn't go after the big guys any longer who are expensive. It goes after the little guys. So then people who get audited, the little guys who get audited say, oh, I hate the IRS, and I'll talk more about the IRS in just a minute. But one of and so this idea of creating chaos and making it look like the federal government can't do anything is one of the ways that they have been able to convince people to act against their own interests, because the federal government, by protecting business regulation, by protecting workers, is actually, by protecting civil rights, is actually working for the little guy, not for the large people, the industrialists, for example, who can dominate state governments, or for the people who otherwise dominate state governments. So they have a real problem right now, because Joe Biden has been extraordinarily successful at demonstrating that the federal government works. So Biden has done something really different than FDR did, although he's definitely in the mold of an FDR Democrat. What FDR did was he tried to protect working men, because he believed that if he protected working men, especially working white men, they would protect their wives and their children. You wanted to get more money into their pockets because that would help the families. So it was a sort of a heteronormative white vision of the way America should work from FDR, although he certainly around the edges bowed to the idea of other people having a say in that. He was really much more focused on white men than he was on anybody else. So he's going to have the first woman in his cabinet, for example, Frances Perkins, who's going to write the concept behind the Social Security Act. But Biden's doing something that seems to me quite different. He, like FDR, like Theodore Roosevelt, like Abraham Lincoln, is deliberately using the federal government to help people at the bottom, not to help people at the top. Now, the current day Republican Party wants to deliver everything to the people at the top because they believe that those are the people who really know how to run society, the same way they did in the 1920s, and that you don't want to mess with the markets because they're the guys who understand the markets. People like Jared Kushner, people like, Donald Trump, they're the guys who really understand how things work. Biden is, like those people before him I mentioned, saying that the federal government should be helping people at the bottom. But there's a crucial difference between him and people like FDR, I think, in that his focus is less on the white nuclear family than it is on children. And by focusing on children and on preserving the safety net for children, that has shifted both his emphasis on the diversity of his administration and of who gets helped. So he's got the most diverse administration in history. But it also means that he is focused on things like elder care and child care. Now, he couldn't get that through Congress, which isn't really a surprise considering the makeup of Congress. But he has been extraordinarily successful at delivering things that people want. So we got the American Rescue Plan, which got the United States out of the pandemic crash of the economy faster than any other developed country. Like every other country, we had inflation after that, but people forget that wages went up almost 5%. Unemployment is at a 50-year low. It was an incredible success. But then he goes on and he got the bipartisan infrastructure bill passed, which again, remember, Trump got elected promising to deliver infrastructure, and he could never do it. It became a joke. Biden managed to pull together a group of people, including some Republicans, to get through infrastructure. So our bridges might not fall down, which is something that honestly has had me worried forever. People really, really, really liked that. So then we got the CHIPS Act. And the CHIPS Act, which is Chips and Science Act, that's another extraordinary. And again, these are coming from Congress. These are not coming from just the executive branch. The CHIPS Act is designed to make America competitive in manufacturing, not only in silicon chips, but also in I'm sorry, I got that word wrong, I'm sure. But also with investments in science and technology, which we haven't done in forever. And that, again, is extraordinary that that got through. And then to turn around and get through the bill that he is signing at this very moment called the Infrastructure Reduction Act, I mean, that's just an incredible coup, because what that does is it does something that both Republicans and Democrats have wanted for ages. Not lawmakers necessarily, not the ideologues in the Republican Party, but that ordinary people want. It will lower prescription drug costs by letting Medicare negotiate for certain drugs, not all of them. And by the way, completely disingenuously, I think it was Rick Scott was on TV talking about how the Democrats were cutting Medicare, which just made me want to throw something at the TV, because what they are doing is by negotiating with the pharmacies, the pharmaceutical producers, they're going to be spending a lot less money on drugs, same amount of them, but a lot less money on them. So all that savings goes to us instead of it all ending up in the pockets of the pharmaceutical companies. And they will tell you they need that research. And Katie Porter has pretty clearly destroyed that and pointed out that basically they're putting it in their pockets. Not entirely, but the vast majority of it. So it lowers drug prices. It invests in the climate, which is, we're so far behind on that front. And it invests in beefing up the IRS from all the cuts that the Republicans have done to it, so that they can go after the wealthy people who have been refusing to pay taxes all this time. And that, again, when somehow some Republican was saying, oh, if you pay more than $20,000, your taxes are going to go up. That's just, I think I said, you need to show your work, because that is absolutely not right. Corporations are going to have to pay a minimum tax of 15%, which again, I mean, it's just so I hate to say it's cool, but I love tax policy, because taxes are about our society. I know the numbers may not sound interesting, but how we write our tax laws says everything about what we think our society should be. And so the infrastructure reduction, I keep doing that. The Inflation Reduction Act, I'm sorry, there's so many I's, imposes a 15% tax on major corporations. And the only reason they can do that is because, you probably don't remember, but Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, way back at the beginning of the administration, spent an incredible amount of time it wasn't just her. I mean, the process had been underway and it got installed, and she stepped in and stepped it up again. Of having a global minimum tax, so that the American companies can't say, well, you're going to charge me 15%. I'm going to go to X country, which is where the corporate tax is only 7%. We have a floor now, so that we're not going to keep rushing to get to a cheaper and cheaper country. And so we have this tax, and it will raise, I think the number is over $700 billion over 10 years, and more than 300. So all of this is paid for. This is what taxes do. And more than 300 billion of it is going to reduce the deficit, not the debt, but the deficit, which we have had the deficit out of whack since the Clinton administration. Bill Clinton actually operated in the black. People forget that, but Bill Clinton was the last president to operate in the black. He brought in more money than he put out in yearly budgets. And the last Republican president to do that was Dwight Eisenhower. So the idea that somehow Democrats are big tax and spend people is a myth. It's actually the Republicans who have done that with unfunded military, for example, and with really again, their whole ideology since the 1980s has been that they can cut taxes and that will promote growth to the point that they will get more in revenue, and that's just never been true. When David Stockman first tried to make that work in the Reagan administration, his computers said, this ain't going to happen, you're going to end up with huge deficits. He just reprogrammed the computers. And that's actually not, reality has an ugly way of reasserting itself. All right, so a couple more questions here about, let me see here. let me go. Oh, let me do a little bit here first on Taiwan, and I am not a specialist in China at all. I read quite a bit about China, but I'm not even going to pretend I know anything about what's happening internally in Taiwan. Anytime that I talk about a foreign country, you always need to remember that what I'm talking about is America and America's relationship with that country, not that country at all. So, for example, when I talk about the Paris Commune in 1871, I don't know what happened in the Paris Commune. I know what Americans thought happened in the Paris Commune. So in terms of Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, and whether or not that was a success or not, let me start by reminding everybody that Joe Biden is probably the most talented foreign affairs president we have had since Eisenhower. And he knows foreign affairs. He has been on the Foreign Relations Committee since, Thomas Jefferson. I'm sorry, I'm kidding, but he knows what he's doing in foreign affairs. So any time I read an article that suggests from some journalist that he doesn't know what he's doing, I don't pay any attention to it, because what that says to me is the journalist doesn't know what's going on, not that Biden doesn't know what's going on. Biden has a very coherent theory of foreign policy. He has articulated it since he took office, and you can agree with it or not, but he is operating very clearly to try and balance a number of different factors. So that's one thing. The second piece about Pelosi's visit to Taiwan and that of a number of other legislators, and now there's been another group that's gone, is that she is nobody's fool. Anybody who thinks that Nancy Pelosi doesn't know what she's doing is just completely out to lunch. She is a political animal. She's definitely one of the best speakers of the House in our history, probably the best. Again, not like her or not, she gets things done. And again, the fact that Biden and Pelosi and Chuck Schumer have managed to translate a squeaky small majority in the Senate to 4 major pieces of legislation, and that's not even considering the things like the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, which had been stalled in the Senate forever. I mean, they are incredibly savvy. So it's not like she just thought, oh, I know what I'll do. I'll go to Taiwan. It was clear, it seemed to me and to many observers, that her visit there was not unwelcome to the administration. So, for example, she could say, hey, I'm going to, the Mars or whatever. And the executive branch, which of course oversees our embassies and our infrastructure for visits, could say, yeah, good luck with that. We're not going to help. But that was not what happened with the case of Pelosi visiting Taiwan. So it's worth remembering that she did not just visit Taiwan. She went to a number of different countries. And at the same time, Antony Blinken was in a number of those countries, and the State Department was announcing a more financial aid to those countries. And Biden has made it a point to invite the leaders of Asian countries and South Asian countries and that whole hemisphere to the White House, and to emphasize how important our relationships are with those countries. And it seems to me pretty clear that what he is trying to do is to emphasize that China is not the only game in town in the globe, which has, of course, been the conversation for a while. And while Donald Trump rose to power by insisting that he was going to go after China and fight with China, and that's how we got those tariffs, he then turned around in January of 2020 and started trying to do deals with Xi Jinping to try and bring the tariffs down so that the Chinese would buy a lot of American soybeans and all kinds of other products so that it would help Trump in the middle of the country for the election. He was which is why he talked really positively about the way that China handled the coronavirus at first. And then, of course, that changed when he realized that there was a pandemic and he was in real trouble. Rather than simply trying to fight China, it seems to me that that Biden is recognizing recognizing that the Chinese economy has been in real trouble if you've been paying attention to it. And that was kind of a way to reiterate that Pelosi didn't do anything new. Newt Gingrich had been to Taiwan in the 1990s, and nobody's policies had changed at all, but they were putting their feet back on the ground to say, we're still here. And China better not start throwing its weight around too much in this region. And what happened was that China did start throwing its weight around. It started to throw missiles around, and the people who looked bad at that point were the Chinese leaders, not the Americans. And that made if you were following news, that made a lot of people, other countries in the area, kind of back off a little bit and think, this is not the stability that we were expecting from China. So the stuff I read suggests that it's actually managed to reassert the idea, not of American power necessarily in that sphere, but the idea that China is not the only monster in the room in that hemisphere, and it is that there are many different interests still at play there. So generally, it seems to have been a big success. So, although from the American perspective, like I say, I just have no idea about any other country and what any other country is doing. Not because I'm not interested, but I don't speak the languages. I have not. I mean, I was reading I was not reading it. I was checking my notes just the other day, and if you remember, Jared Kushner said he was going to solve the Palestinian-Israeli crisis because he had studied it for 3 years and read 25 books. And honest to God, for somebody like me, studying something for 3 years and reading 25 books probably makes you feel like you've got enough authority maybe to carry on a conversation with an expert, to ask questions. But the idea that anybody with that little study would presume to make any statements is kind of mind-boggling. So never think that I'm speaking for another country. All right, so where are we now? Somebody asked about, when will the Republicans stop playing politics and stand up for the country? Somebody else asked if we should be concerned about election deniers, and somebody else asked if we should be concerned about the move among a number of Republican-dominated states to hold a constitutional convention. And the answer to that is yes. That for all that, as I just said, the Biden administration has been, I'll be honest, shockingly successful. I mean, I hate to say this, but I really thought that he was going to be a placeholder, that with the numbers he had and with I didn't think he was going to accomplish anything except he wasn't going to be Trump. And that was going to be enough. He was going to be old and fatherly, and he was going to remind us of who we could be. I truly did not expect the kind of presidency that we're seeing. So that being said, that demonstration of, of a government that works, quite frankly. I mean, a government where a president and members of Congress are getting together and they're doing things that the American people like. And it is worth remembering that Republicans and Democrats both like the Inflation Reduction Act. Not the lawmakers, but ordinary people like those things. If you look at polls, we like those. We like infrastructure. We like Roe v. Wade too. We liked a lot of the things that right now the Biden administration and the Democrats represent. We don't like what the radical Republicans represent. So this is a huge problem for people who identify as Republican lawmakers, not necessarily Republican voters, Republican lawmakers, because the ideology and the policies that they are pushing, the idea of sunsetting laws every 5 years, for example, which will wipe out Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security and every law that we've got on the books. The idea of getting rid of abortion rights, the idea of getting rid of the interstate commerce, the laws based on the Interstate Commerce Act, which is one of the things that is important to Justice Thomas. all those things are really not popular. We like the government to be the government that we had after 1933. So with that problem on the table, the Republican Party today has to focus on its base in order to get elected. And the problem is that base was really radicalized by Donald Trump. So they were already out there. They talked about not wanting abortion. They talked about, the sort of getting rid of the government. But the Republicans didn't really have to do that so long as they could get those guys to turn out. Now, with the overturning of Roe versus Wade and with the realization that former President Trump has really essentially turned to the concept of fascist gangs, which is, we have a long history in this country of extra-legal gangs, and those can be, there's a theory behind this, but essentially those have been weaponized and radicalized, especially after the Charlottesville riots, but then into 2020, Trump has really turned his supporters into a very dangerous group of people who, as I say, threaten the IRS agents, threaten their opponents. They've cleaned out school boards. They are essentially street thugs at this point. And for the Republican Party now, that's their base. So they can't leave that, and they can't abandon Trump without losing that. And once they've lost that, they either have to give up their ideology altogether, which they have gone so far down that rabbit hole, I'm not sure how they can do that, or they simply have to become Democrats, and that's not going to happen either. So what they have done is recognizing that they can't win an election fair and square any longer because people don't like what they're selling. What they have done is they have taken refuge in the states and have allied themselves around the concept that our elections don't work, that Donald Trump was cheated of his victory, which is absolutely a lie, and that in the future, elections are only valid if a Republican wins, which is not democracy. It is authoritarianism. And the Supreme Court will be weighing in on that in the future under something called the Independent State Legislature Doctrine, the idea that state legislatures alone, without being checked by state courts or by the federal government, get to decide who gets states' electoral votes. The idea then is to maintain a Republican like Trump in office to impose not that market-based ideology that the Republican Party embraced with Ronald Reagan, but rather what looks like a theocracy, the idea that we're going to have an established religion of some form of evangelical Christianity. Mind you, it's not going to be every kind of Christianity. There's going to be some limits, of course, to that. And we're going to reinstate sort of the idea of putting, a theocracy, an authoritarian theocracy in place. Now, do Americans want that? Absolutely not. The vast majority of us don't want that, but the Republicans are trying to put that in place. And with that, we have the threat of a number of Republican-dominated states to call a constitutional convention, which they can do under our Constitution, and to rewrite the Constitution. So should you be concerned about that? Absolutely. But that being said, the reason that violence is escalating, the reason that Donald Trump is frantic about the affidavit for the search warrant on Mar-a-Lago, the reason that you can feel everything ratcheting up is because it seems to me anyway that they are recognizing that they're losing a grip on chaos. They're losing a grip on the idea that the government doesn't work. People are starting to have more confidence in our country and in each other and in the idea that really the system does work, so long as there are people of goodwill who are trying to make it work rather than tearing it apart. And that has made them very, very nervous indeed, because if in fact Joe Biden can demonstrate that the government works, not necessarily that it does what you want it to, that's the whole point of a democracy. You should be out there working to get what you want, but you need to have a working system to make that happen. And he certainly seems to be demonstrating that to the American people. That fundamentally will tear the rug out from underneath those who are trying to destroy our system. All right, so on a happy note, what can you do? the usual. Vote, of course. Take your friends to vote. Talk to your friends about the things that are important to you, because any political scientist will tell you that you are far more likely to change your friends' minds than anybody like me talking at them. And, there are plenty of places here that people will put in the chat of places to give money and places to participate in our system. Run for office yourself. But you know me, I always end with the idea that we change the American system by changing the public conversation. And that's a question of speaking up and saying, hey, I really love the idea of, for example, today's going into place that hearing aids are going to be available over the counter, which makes them so much cheaper for so many people. And that we're getting our government to step in and defend people like you and me, and to work for people like you and me, rather than just for, the Jared Kushners and the Peter Thiels of the world. So speak up and make sure that your registration is in order for this next election, and keep the faith. Thank you for being here, and I will see you tonight, I guess, but maybe Thursday. Talk to you later.